Okay. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. My name is Amani Sharifuddin, and I am the program coordinator here at Nisa Helpline, and I will also be your host for the day. Thank you all for joining our first workshop on the wisdom of anxiety in collaboration with Bell Let's Talk. So through our partnership, we're hosting a series of virtual workshops on her wellness journey. And these workshops are designed to improve Muslim women's access to social supports, build self-esteem, and emotional well-being. So before we start, we do have some rules we would appreciate that you consider. And these are to please ensure that your mic is off, just to not accidentally interrupt the session. And if you have any questions, for those of you who are tuning in through Zoom, please use the Q&A window to ask your questions. And our panelists and hosts will monitor, inshallah, to make sure we get all the questions ahead of time. And we'll either reply to you via that window on the Q&A section, or we're going to ask that question to our guest speaker during the Q&A portion of the segment. Okay. And one more thing, one more thing is that we do have polling questions that we will be sharing during the session. And this just helps us understand you, help us, keep you engaged and understand your needs so that we can create more workshops like this one. And now, without further ado, this evening we are joined by our honored guest, Kamela Salimi, to discuss the wisdom of anxiety. So a little bit about Kamela. Kamela is a registered psychotherapist for the past 7 years now and has a master's degree in couples and family therapy from the University of Guelph. She was also part of the first group to obtain Cambridge Muslim College's diploma in Islamic psychology, mashallah. And in the summer of 2022, she completed a 2-week intensive program in Cambridge, UK. Kamela has extensive experience working with Muslim women impacted by trauma and provides compassionate support by increasing self-esteem, emotional regulation, and addressing relationship issues. Outside of work, Kamela loves nature and often goes for hikes for self-care and grounding. So please join me in welcoming Kamela Salimi. Assalamu alaikum, Kamela. How are you doing this evening?
Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. So before we begin, I ask that you please respond to the following first set of survey questions that I mentioned earlier. If you are uncomfortable responding, that is also okay. You're not obligated to answer them. Again, this just helps us get to know you, who's tuning in, and how you found out about today's workshop. So for those of you who do respond, your answers will remain anonymous. So I'm going to put that set of questions up now and give you approximately a minute because they're not really extensive questions. They should take about a minute. So there should be up right now. Beautiful. I'm seeing some responses. Nice. Give you another 30 seconds. The responses are coming in. Mashallah, I see we have a lot of individuals tuning in from Central Canada. Beautiful. Okay, I am going to end it now. Here we go. Okay, great. Awesome. So now, thank you guys all for your input, and Kamela, the stage is all yours.
All right, thank you so much. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen. All right, whoops. Okay, bismillah. So welcome to my workshop, The Wisdom of Anxiety. Before I jump into the workshop, I'm just going to start with a quick guided meditation. I'm hearing that a lot of people are from Central, I think, Canada. So end of the day, a lot of us are probably feeling a bit tired. So I'm just going to do a breathing activity just to get us all grounded as I continue with the workshop. So you don't really have to do anything, just kind of follow my lead. And to begin with, just make sure you're sitting comfortably. If you can make sure your back is straight and your feet is flat on the ground. And if you're comfortable for this part of the activity, you can close your eyes. If you choose not to, that's fine as well. So we're going to start just by paying attention to our breath and notice any tension you might be holding in your body. And in particular, just pay attention to your shoulder, your jaws, your brows, your eyes, your forehead, any other parts of your body that are maybe tense. And we're just going to start to take a few conscious, slow breaths. And I want us to do a long inhale with an even longer exhale. I won't kind of lead the breathing for you. You'll do your own breathing at your own pace. And I want you to just start. Remember, intentional and slow breaths. And as you're breathing, I just want you to notice and pay attention to the oxygen entering into your body and just cleansing your lungs. The breath is such a simple blessing, and sometimes we're not even aware of it, right? It's simple yet so significant. And I want you to just continue breathing. And as you breathe, notice any tension you might be holding in your body, any physical sensations that are coming up. And just as you breathe out, imagine you're breathing out all of that tension with you. Any aches, pains, discomforts. And just continue to breathe. And as you breathe, if you notice your thoughts going in different places, if you're thinking about the stressors of today, of the future, and you're noticing you're starting to judge yourself, just bring yourself back to your breath gently. And do that as many times as you need to. Keep gently coming back to the breath. And next, I want you to just lower your head a little bit and notice your heart. Take another deep breath and imagine the expansiveness of your heart as all this oxygen enters your body. And see if you can connect with and notice your heart. Within our faith, the heart is the spiritual center of the human being. So just connect with that spiritual center and be with your heart. And as you notice this heart and pay attention to this heart, think of the one who created this heart, this soul, and this body. The one who is also seeing this heart and holding this heart. The one who is aware of the joys and the pains of this heart, the constrictions and the expansions of this heart. The one who describes himself in the Quran multiple times as the most compassionate and the most merciful. Pay attention to what that feels like for you as you notice this heart and feel the presence of the one who created this heart. Notice what that feels like in your body. And just sit with that. And I'm going to gently ask you to bring yourself to the present with me. Take as much time as you need. just to bring yourself back. Notice again your feet flat on the floor. And just come back whenever you're ready. I'm going to give everyone a few seconds. All right. So for those of you who participated, thank you. I hope that that felt grounding for you. And we're going to just get started with the workshop. So I'm talking about anxiety today. And before we get into managing anxiety, I think it's important to define what anxiety is. So according to the American Psychological Association, anxiety is an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. This feels a little bit complicated and hard to understand. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'll try my best to simplify everything so that when you leave this workshop, everything feels very practical. So I'm going to continue to talk a little bit more about anxiety and what it looks like practically. So expanding on this definition, what does anxiety feel like in our thoughts? And so what this looks like is racing, cynical thoughts, worrying we'll mess up, worrying how others may view us, feeling a sense of impending doom, sometimes feeling like we're going to pass out, trouble concentrating, wanting to disappear or run away. So that's what anxiety looks like in our thoughts. When it comes to how it manifests in our body, often what it looks like is breathing rapidly, breathlessness, heart pounding, sweating, body feeling hot, trembling, restlessness, feeling weak and lightheaded, trouble sleeping, forgetting to eat, overeating, gut issues, butterflies in stomach, nausea, diarrhea, all of those things. To give you even more context, I'll share some examples of anxiety that often come up in sessions for me, both inside of sessions, but also outside of sessions. So there's often anxiety related to the self. So am I enough? Am I too much? Am I worthy? Anxiety around acceptance and belonging, anxiety about our health. Relationship anxiety is another huge one. Anxiety about parenting. Am I doing a good job? Am I damaging my kids? Marital, premarital anxiety, anxiety when it comes to faith. Is God pleased with me? Is God happy with me? Am I a good Muslim? Things like that. Anxiety with in-laws, extended family, anxiety around conflict, fear of conflict, conflict management, all of those things that are a normal part of relationships. Anxiety around money, especially if we have a history of poverty. Anxiety around job, work, school, performance, anxiety about the future. So climate change is a big one for many of us. So as you can see, anxiety is pretty broad and pretty much anything can be a source of anxiety when there's uncertainty connected to it and when there's unfamiliarity. All right. So now that I've given you the definition of anxiety and some practical examples of what anxiety looks like and how it manifests, I'm going to ask you guys a question. Based on this definition, have you ever felt anxious? And if yes, how high has the intensity gotten to? 1 being very low, 10 being very high intensity. So I'll give everyone a second to answer that question. And if everyone can participate, that would be really, really great because I want this workshop to I want everyone to engage so that you're taking lots of knowledge with you when you leave.
We'll give it another 20 seconds.
No problem. All right, so I'm just gonna, okay, so to the first part of the question, 100% of the people have experienced anxiety. And when it comes to intensity, wow, we have a significant percentage that's marked 7 or higher. So thank you everyone for answering. my objective behind asking this question was just to normalize that we all experience anxiety. It's not something that just affects one or two of us and everybody else is exempt from it. We all, to an extent, experience anxiety. It comes with being human. And as the results show, for many of us, it's intense anxiety at different points. All right. All right, so some of the common narratives I found around anxiety is that even though it's so common with all of us experiencing it, people usually think anxiety are for people who are weak, that religion should be enough to prevent us from getting anxious, and that anxiety is bad. And to live a fulfilling life, we must get rid of anxiety. So the narrative is, how do we make anxiety go away? How do we make anxiety disappear? And so what I'm aiming to do in this workshop is to offer a different perspective on anxiety. I'm going to argue that anxiety can actually serve as a protective factor and is looking out for us. The example being, if we're running to cross a street, anxiety is that feeling that holds us back and says, wait, look both ways, we don't want to get hit by a car, and stops us. And so we need anxiety, and to an extent, it protects us. Right? The key is anxiety in moderation is a good thing and can have a positive effect on our well-being. In order to kind of get this point to hit home, I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig in this workshop to talk a little bit about my anxiety and how anxiety can be a good thing. All right. So we talked today a little bit about how anxiety manifests in our thoughts and in our body. I'm going to talk a little bit about how is anxiety showing up for me right now as someone who is an introvert, as someone who prefers to work behind the scenes, and as someone who does not like public speaking. So as you can imagine, I'm pretty anxious right now. I've been a bit anxious throughout the day thinking about this presentation. And so what are some of the thoughts that have been crossing my mind? Some of my anxious thoughts have been, am I going to do a good job? Will my presentation be received in the way that I intend for it to be received? Will I make Nisa Helpline proud? Will they invite me back? All of those things. And then being very conscious of my age, I'm thinking, you know, are there therapists who are older than me, who have more years of experience that might do a better job? And ultimately, the last and I think biggest question for me is, am I going to do justice to this presentation, and will Allah be pleased with me? And those questions make me anxious, right? And so how this manifests in my body, uniquely for me and my anxiety, is my heart starts pounding. I'm noticing I need to take deep breaths. Right now, I'm not shaking, but I tend to shake a little bit. I have butterflies in my stomach, and I tend to feel really hot. And in particular, it shows up in my face. So this is how my anxiety shows up, particularly for public speaking. So we've talked about anxiety, we've talked about what it is, how it manifests. I've used myself as an example of how my anxiety shows up. And so the obvious next question is, how do we manage anxiety? And how can we tap into its protective factors? And then how can we also manage it? And so in the therapy and mental health world, interventions are also often divided into two pathways. We have the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And I'm going to show what each approach looks like with managing different types of anxiety. So for my public speaking anxiety, we're going to use the top-down approach. And I want you, as I'm doing this activity, to think about your own anxiety and if this approach or intervention works for you. All right. So the top-down approach manages anxiety by addressing the thoughts. And so it's about thinking and addressing the thoughts. And often what this looks like in the therapy world is CBT models, narrative models, solution-focused models. And the idea is, when you notice the thoughts and you change the thoughts, you change the emotion, and therefore you change the behavior. So it's a step-by-step solution that looks and addresses the thoughts. And it's called the top-down approach. And so I'm going to use that on myself right now for my public speaking anxiety. And this is a 5-step intervention that I created. If you look online, there's lots of different types of top-down approach you can use. Feel free to copy off of this if this feels like it fits for you. So what I start by doing is step one, I notice the anxiety by tuning into my body and to my thoughts. And I've already done that. I've named in the previous slides my thoughts and what I'm feeling in my body. I then ask the anxiety, what is it worried about? What does it want from me? Why is it showing up for me? And ultimately, the anxiety is there because it wants me to do a good job. The anxiety doesn't want me to mess up. The anxiety wants me to do justice to this presentation, to this role that I've been honored with. And so, as you can see, the anxiety is very well-intentioned, but it's just very worried, right? And so instead of responding to the anxiety with frustration, with anger, with fear, with hopelessness, I actually thank the anxiety for showing up, for worrying about me, for looking out for me, for wanting the best for me. And in step 4, I actually engage with the anxiety as if I'm speaking to another person. So what is the anxiety worried about? What evidence can I provide to the anxiety that I'm actually going to be okay? And that I have the tools to be able to handle this presentation and to share the knowledge that I've gained in the last few years. And so I remind the anxiety, I've been a therapist for 7 years. I've done a lot of work on anxiety. I've done presentations before, and that I'm going to be okay. If the anxiety is concerned about my preparedness, I remind the anxiety, I researched this topic, I've rehearsed it. Nisa Helpline was kind enough to offer rehearsals for me to make sure I'm really prepared for this presentation. And so all of those things are just going to calm the anxiety down. I'm addressing all the worries of the anxiety. Part of being Muslim and being part of a faith group is also really important in the top-down approach, because I think about what role does God, what role does Allah play in this? Allah is here, Allah is with me, Allah is supporting me. I've made lots of du'as. I've asked my loved ones to pray for me. And ultimately, I'm going to let go of the control that I think I have and accept that ultimately anything that comes from Allah is good. Whether I get through this presentation is good, it's from Allah. If I freeze up, it's also from Allah. I just show up as a vessel and Allah will do his work through me. And so after I engage with the anxiety, step 5, I take a deep breath and I proceed. And so this is the kind of 5-step top-down approach that I can use in this with this specific anxiety of public speaking. As I mentioned, religion can play a significant role in the top-down approach to managing anxiety. Within our faith, we have many tools that can help us calm our anxiety down. What as an example, what I pulled from was the 99 names of Allah. I went through the 99 names. I found ones that are relevant to me and that are relevant to managing anxiety. So the giver of peace, the expander, right? Often when we feel anxiety, we tend to feel constricted, the protecting friend, the loving one. All of those things can help calm that anxiety down. All right. So in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about trauma and anxiety. What I've explained so far is pretty self-explanatory. We know what anxiety is. We define anxiety. We use the top-down approach to manage anxiety. Seems pretty simple. When trauma enters the conversation, it's a complete game changer. It changes anxiety to the point where the top-down approach no longer works, and we have to shift to the bottom-up approach. And if this sounds a little bit confusing, I'm going to break it down in the next few slides. All right. So again, going back to definitions, because those are really important. If we're going to talk about trauma and anxiety, I have to define trauma. So a very broad general definition is trauma can be defined as anything that subjectively feels too much, too fast, too soon, too much for too long, or not enough for too long. As you can see, this is pretty vague. The idea is it's supposed to be vague because trauma is not about a specific event. It's actually about the impact of the event, and the impact can be different from person to person. If you want a more specific definition of trauma, another one is when we experience something when we don't have the tools to cope with that thing. That is also considered trauma. So again, recognizing that I'm giving very broad definitions, I'm going to ask my next poll question, which is, based on this definition of trauma, have you ever personally experienced trauma? So I'll give you guys a few minutes to answer that.
I'll give it another 10 seconds and then I'll post.
All right. Okay, so a very significant percentage have experienced trauma. And again, there's a reason why I asked this question, is to just normalize the idea that trauma is a very normal and natural part of being human. We often experience events that might feel too overwhelming for us and can then be traumatic. All right. Okay. So, to understand the impact that trauma has on anxiety, we actually have to go to the brain and talk a little bit about the brain. I want to mention that I'm not an expert on the brain or the anatomy of the brain, so I'm going to try to keep this very simple and not also not complicated so that all of you can understand. So the brain has 3 parts that work to manage stress: the amygdala, which is the emotional and instinctual center, the hippocampus, which controls memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which regulates emotions and rational thinking and critical thinking. What happens to the brain when we experience trauma, and when we experience something that triggers a memory of that traumatic experience, the amygdala goes into overdrive and acts as if we're experiencing that traumatic event for the first time. The hippocampus has reduced activity and has a hard time distinguishing between the event and the memory of the event. So both feel very real. And the prefrontal cortex, which looks at critical thinking and problem solving, goes offline. So as you can see, trauma affects the brain in a significant way. And so how is this all related to anxiety? Well, when we experience trauma, it's as if anxiety goes on steroids, right? So it's no longer anxiety in moderation, it's anxiety on steroids. So what that looks like is a state of hypervigilance, suppression of memory and impulse control. As I mentioned, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. There's a constant state of emotional reactivity. And what trauma does is it moves us from connection to curiosity to protection and safety. The world no longer feels safe, relationships don't feel safe, we can't really trust anyone. And so it's all about safety, 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 and protection. To make this even more digestible, I'm going to provide some examples of trauma and the trauma response that it's coupled with. Trauma response shows up when we've experienced a trauma trigger, and it's a protective behavior. So again, I mentioned anxiety protects us, so does trauma responses, and I'll explain how. So the common trauma people think about is war and violence. So when there's specific sounds, images, and smells of war and violence that we might have experienced, it might trigger trauma. And so the trauma response in that case might be avoidance. So we're going to avoid that smell, that image, or those sounds because it reminds us of that traumatic memory. And again, for the brain, it thinks we're in that memory, even though it's in the past. Certain relationship dynamics can also trigger trauma. So if we've experienced abuse in one relationship and then we try to enter into a new relationship, the process of opening up, of trusting, of being vulnerable becomes very tricky because the trauma response in this case becomes kind of shutting down, withdrawing, not engaging with people. Being very independent, by the way, is a trauma response. And I always say some of the most independent people in the world are also some of the most traumatized. Why is that? Because trauma responses believes that if we completely rely on ourselves and we don't rely on people, we can stay safe, right? So safety becomes priority. Childhood trauma is another big one. If we experience dysfunctional, chaotic home environments where there was rejection, abuse, abandonment, emotional neglect, it can affect us as adults and throughout our life. And so when it comes to our attachment, we might avoid relationships altogether, or when we are in relationships, we're very anxious, we're clingy, we need constant reassurance, we're afraid that the person's going to leave us. Often we kind of let go of our own individuality and who we are and kind of mold into the other person so that they can, so that they don't leave us, right? Bullying is also a trauma, and that can happen in workplaces and schools, things like that. Whereas even if you enter a new workplace and the people are completely safe, your trauma responses might show up and you might not feel safe even in that newer environment. Faith-related trauma is another big one. So if faith was used as a tool for control or abuse, participating in acts of worship, such as even, holy acts, such as reading the Quran or praying, can be traumatic for someone and can cause their brain, the prefrontal cortex, to go offline. And that can be really, really hard for some people to understand, because we say, but it's faith, right? It's from Allah. Like, how can that be bad, right? And so I just want to make a point that when it comes to faith, be really, really careful about not re-traumatizing faith. When you're talking about faith, when you're preaching or telling people what to do, because you can actually re-traumatize them, even if you're coming from a very well-intentioned place, from a place that really, really loves the faith, right? So just being extra careful. So again, the trauma response, as I mentioned, is a protective response. It's those parts of us wanting to protect us from getting hurt, from feeling abandoned. And so the trauma responses are avoidance, things like that. So it's protective, but it's misled, right? All right. So in this case, what I'm saying is that trauma sometimes and trauma triggers can make the prefrontal cortex, the part that thinks critically, go offline. So the top-down approach is no longer effective, because to do the top-down approach, you have to be able to think clearly and make sense of things and problem solve. You can't do that when the prefrontal cortex is offline. So this is probably the worst time if you notice that someone is dysregulated, emotions are super heightened, they don't look like they're okay, for you to start telling them to calm down, to tell them they're being irrational, to tell them to have faith in Allah and be strong. It's not about faith, it's not about morals, it's not about character. It's about the prefrontal cortex has gone offline, right? And the person can no longer regulate themselves. So with that said, I'm going to ask my last and final poll question, which is, have you ever made the mistake of using the top-down approach to support someone when their prefrontal cortex is offline?
We'll give it another 10 seconds.
All right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for being honest, everyone. We have a very significant percentage, over around 77%, that admit they have tried to use the top-down approach when a person's prefrontal cortex is offline. And there's 23% that said no to the answer. And I'm pretty amazed, because that's hard to do. Okay, I'm just going to close the poll. All right. So if we can't use the top-down approach, in this case, to manage anxiety that comes as a result of trauma, what then is the other option? And this is the other pathway that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is the bottom-up approach. And how is bottom-up different from top-down? Well, the idea is, in order for a person to be able to think clearly, to calm down, the prefrontal cortex has to come back online. And in order to do that, we're going to go through the body, calm the body down, and then help the brain come back online. And so what that looks like in the therapy world is somatic techniques. Somatic techniques are anything as mentioned on the slide relating to or affecting the body. When we calm down the body, when the body starts to feel safe and calm and grounded, the brain goes back online and we can use the top-down approach. So in the therapy world, models that use bottom-up approach include EMDR, IFS, trauma-informed yoga, etc. All right, so to make this even more practical for you, so that you have techniques you can use for yourself, not that you don't really have to go to therapy to do. You can still do therapy, but some bottom-up techniques include breathing exercises. So what happens when we're anxious and we're dysregulated is we tend to take shallow breaths, and there's not as much oxygen getting into the body, into the brain, things like that. And so boxed breathing is one example of slowing down the breath, of getting oxygen into the body, and then the body calming down. The box breathing is 4 by 4 by 4, which means 4 seconds breathe in, 4 seconds pause, 4 seconds breathe out. The next one is take a cold shower, wash your hands, face with cold water, go for a walk, pray, any sort of movement, watching a calming video, listening to something soothing, Quran, nasheed, songs, make a warm cup of tea, feel the cup of tea on your hands. If you're around people and noises, take a few minutes to yourself and go somewhere quiet. Also, there's co-regulation. So if you happen to have an anxious friend or anxious family member that you want to support, remember that if their prefrontal cortex is offline, you'll be able to see this very clearly because they'll be very dysregulated. They won't be thinking clearly. Instead of problem solving, using the top-down approach, say things like, I'm here for you. Is there anything I can do to help? Lots of validation. Do you need space? Let's do some breathing activities together. Let's go for a walk. If you see that they've calmed down enough, that the body has calmed and that they're able to think a little bit more rationally, and the brain has come back online, then you can go into top-down approach, which is bringing religion into it, asking what helped you get through this last time, what tools do you have now that you didn't have before? Can we problem solve together? Things like that. All right, so that's an example of co-regulation. Pets can be a great example of co-regulators. The other thing is, under the helpful statements, touch is also really, really important. So saying things like, do you need a hug? Do you need to be held? And if you don't have someone who can help you co-regulate, touch for yourself is really, really important. So if you're feeling anxious and you're feeling butterflies in your stomach, put your hand on your stomach and just hold it there. If you need to kind of rub your legs, things like that, that can really calm down the body. So I talked about the top-down approach, the bottom-up approach, as if they kind of are separate and are in vacuums. The reality is anxiety exists on a spectrum. Trauma triggers also impact us on a spectrum. Often the best approach, depending on how intense the anxiety is to use the two together. The top-down, the bottom-up approach. And I used a lot of that today as I was preparing for the slide. I did my rehearsals. I went for a bike ride. There was a somatic piece to that. Bringing it back to the faith piece, the daily prayers can be really, really powerful. It's a combined approach to the top-down and the bottom-up approach. So the prayers combined with wudu, key point. So there's a somatic component, because when we do wudu, we're putting water on our face, our hands, that actually calms the body down. It regulates the nervous system. There's movement in prayer. If you look at things like trauma-informed yoga, I've done that before. A lot of the movements are very similar to the movements that we're instructed to do during prayer. There's words to recite, remembering Allah, remembering His mercy, remembering His compassion. So that's the top-down approach. And then it offers co-regulation. You are connected with God in this prayer. You are complaining to God of your worries, of your heartache, all of those things, which I think is pretty incredible. The point I'll add that I'm really passionate about is in the Islamic psychology course that I was taking, one of the things one of the professors said was that Islam in itself is a form of therapy, that the acts, the rituals that are advised, they're very holistic. They address the needs of the mind, the body, and the soul, the daily prayers being a really great example. So where I'm trying to go with this point is you don't have to go far to do things to regulate your nervous system, go back to the faith. It's already there. All right, so summary points for my presentation. Anxiety in moderation can serve as a protective factor. And if the anxiety, you're feeling it gets a little bit too much, the top-down approach can be really powerful to help you self-soothe and manage your anxiety and other people's anxiety. Trauma changes things with anxiety because trauma heightens anxiety. Trauma impacts the brain and our ability to think critically as parts of our brain go offline. And so the top-down approach is not always effective in this case. So what we want to do is use the bottom-up approach for intense anxiety that's related to trauma. And often the combination of the two can be really effective. Last point is, if you're seeking therapy for trauma, connect with a therapist that uses a bottom-up approach or a combination of the two and works with the brain and the body. Right? What a good therapist will do is it's almost, resetting the brain, refreshing the brain, resetting the nervous system. And by the way, you can't do that by talking to a friend, right? So yes, co-regulation is important. Top down is really, really important. But if you've experienced really intense trauma, therapy can be really, really powerful, and it can get certain goals achieved that might not happen by talking to a friend about it. All right. So that's my last slide. Thank you for your time. If you liked anything that I presented on, please follow me on my Instagram page, Mindful Mend. You can also visit me on my website, kamelasalimi.com. And I've been told there's a question answer session, so I'm going to pass it over to Amani to kind of lead that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kamela, for this amazing presentation. We do have a few questions for you. So let me pull that up. First, we have some questions actually in relation to if anybody is going to get access to the slides. Yes, we will be posting it on our YouTube, inshallah. Let me actually put our YouTube direct link in the chat, so you guys will be getting access to that, inshallah, after. And a second question I got is about the 99 names. We will be sharing a resource list after, so you will be getting access to those as well, in a list that you can pull out whenever you need. So now, Kamela, our question. So we have one that says, what are good things to say to someone who is offline? My husband struggles with helping me once I'm no longer thinking rational and cannot calm myself down in the middle of a panic attack. What are things you recommend to say to someone in this state?
So I closed my slides, but I would go back to that one example of co-regulation, of lots and lots of validation. I do couples counseling, and I don't want to generalize, but I often find that male partners tend to be problem solvers and tend to offer solutions, and we don't always need solutions. So lots of validation, lots of I'm here for you, lots of you're going to be okay, you're doing great, lots of what you need from me, right? Sometimes it might be I need to be held. Sometimes it might be I need to be left alone. And that can be really hard for people. Especially if a loved one looks like they're struggling. So I think I answered that in that slide. I would go back to that slide.
Okay, awesome. And then another question we have is, how can I manage my anxiety in public, like at school or at the workplace?
Okay. So the answer to this question would really depend on what does the anxiety uniquely feel like for you? What is triggering that anxiety? Is there trauma related to that? So what I would do in a therapy session is I usually spend the first session doing a really thorough assessment. And based on that assessment, I would give strategies that's unique to that individual, because anxiety shows up differently for all of us. And then the strategies would be different. Again, I would go back to those depending on how intense the anxiety shows up, going back to those somatic techniques of just slowing your breath down, right? It's what I've been doing throughout this presentation. Every few seconds when I can, I take a deep breath, go to the bathroom. If you're at work, if you're at school, go to the bathroom, wash your hands with cold water, things like that. But again, it would really depend on that anxiety, the unique anxiety and the unique intervention.
That makes sense. And another one we have is, how would you suggest to go about faith-based anxiety when you want to reach out to Allah and find comfort in Him, but when you're offline, Allah can be a trigger and you find an intense fear of Him that you then avoid?
Okay, so I would say in that case, don't force yourself to use faith as a coping strategy, because it sounds like it's not helping. And it doesn't mean you're a bad Muslim. Again, there might be trauma that related to that. So use whatever coping strategy works until you come back online, and then you can use faith. So don't force yourself to do anything if it's not working. You're not a bad Muslim.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you then recommend using, again, the bottom top approach?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And for everybody, the bottom top approach, for everybody, different strategies works. So for some people, breathing might not help. Like it might make things a little bit worse. So then go wash your face with cold water. Do whatever you need to do that works for you.
Yep. Okay. And then how do we start to heal from our trauma after we have recognized our triggers?
Well, I would say first, congratulations for recognizing your triggers. That's really good insight and awareness. And that can be a really powerful tool if you choose to go to seek therapy, because you're coming in with that self-awareness that's going to make therapy really effective. Again, it depends on the trauma, on the intensity of the trauma, the impact it's had on the brain. Because depending on the impact, it might not be something that you can resolve on your own. That's why therapists exist, and we can help with that. Although I recognize that, therapy is not always accessible. So unfortunately, yeah.
And another one we have is, how do I know that I am how do I know that I am experiencing anxiety for someone who didn't learn to listen to their body?
Yeah. That's a really good question. One of my teachers at the Islamic psychology course made the statement that really stuck with me. She said, we live in disembodied times, right? And we're often in our heads, we're thinking about things, we're rationalizing things, we're very disconnected from our body, and our body is constantly communicating with us, constantly giving us hints about how we're doing internally. So what I would say is start to practice being in your body. Be intentional, for example, about just slowing your breath down, right? Begin to pay attention if you notice any sensations, any tension anywhere in your body. An activity like yoga, for example, or even daily prayers, like if you really slow down, you'll start to begin to notice kind of what's happening in your body. But it requires being mindful and just really, really slowing down and paying attention.
Okay. And is there a list of grounding techniques to try when triggered?
When triggered, as in when the brain goes offline?
Yeah. Would it be again the top down?
Yeah, it would be the top. Sorry. Yeah, the bottom up.
Yeah.
Sorry. So go back to that bottom up list I gave you: the box breathing, the cold water, co-regulation, all of those things.
Yeah. And again, everybody tuned in, you will be getting this resource list. You can access it on our website. And if you register through Zoom, you will be getting it emailed to you directly, inshallah. And we have some more questions. Alhamdulillah, everybody's tuning in all the questions towards the end. Are there any useful mobile apps that you recommend?
Okay. I'll be honest, I don't know too much about apps. I know there's the Ruh app that was created specifically for the Muslim community. I don't know too much about it though, so I can't speak on it. There's also an app called Calm. I think there's mindful meditations you can do, things like that. Amani, if you have any suggestions, feel free to chime in.
Oh yeah, I heard of Calm too. That one I think is very good. I also know that there's some apps that help you with writing down your thoughts and kind of helping you break it down. Don't have the exact names for it, but you can find them anywhere. If you look for journaling apps, they help you with kind of breaking down your thoughts.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah. Another question we have is, do you have tips for social anxiety and avoiding social interactions? Trauma definitely makes it worse.
These questions are very tricky because it depends again on the trauma that you've experienced and how the anxiety is manifesting. What are kind of the internalized beliefs that are coming up when you're with a group of people? Is there questions about worthiness, about enoughness, all of those things? And for example, let's say it's about self-worth and self-esteem, that I feel like I can't be with this group of girls because I'm not enough. Well, a therapist would explore, where's the lack of enoughness, that belief coming from? And that is deeper work, right? So sometimes the conversation might be social anxiety, but when we go in deeper, it might be related to, again, the word trauma was mentioned there, a lot of other things that needs to be unpacked. But again, if go back to the bottom top approaches, if you want to push yourself to kind of socialize with someone, when you go in, just, you know, do some of those breathing activities. If you can, use the top-down approach. Affirmations can be really, really important to just say, you know, I'm going to be okay, things like that.
Yeah. Okay. And then we do have some questions about your profession.
All right.
Somebody's asking, do you offer therapy? I am looking for a therapist.
Yes, I do offer therapy. I put my website on the last slide. That's my information about my practice will be there. And you can see kind of my areas of expertise, and if it matches with what you're looking for, on my website, you can contact me and we can schedule a phone call.
Okay, great. And then somebody's also asking, do you offer therapy sessions for teenagers?
I usually work with, it depends on how old they are. I work with young adults and up. But if someone is looking for therapy for a teenager, I know lots of great therapists that I can recommend.
Okay, and then we do have one more question, and it is somebody saying, I am on an 18-month wait list for a PTSD program with CAMH. I need therapy in the meantime. How can I find a therapist who incorporates Islam in their methodology?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Yeah, as you mentioned, the Islamic psychology program that I did, we were the first cohort, and there was 30 of us, and we're all around the world, right? So it wasn't just 30 in Ontario. Yeah, that's a tricky question to answer. I would encourage you, like, if you go on a directory like Psychology Today, you can make your search unique by looking for Muslim therapists. And when you do the consult with the therapist, you can ask them. And a lot of people ask me during the initial consult, faith is really important to me. Can you incorporate faith into the sessions? And then there you can ask the therapist if they do that, and then also ask about where they've gotten their training, right? I'm sure there's a lot of therapists out there. I'm just not aware of them. So.
And that's a normal question to ask though, right? Because I know some people do feel like maybe it like questions their credentials if they ask those questions, but that is okay to ask, right?
No, you can ask. By the way, in the consult, you can ask like any question you want, right? Like you can ask the therapist, like, do they have a therapist? You can ask the therapist, are there things you don't like working with? You can ask the therapist, what do you do for self-care, right? Because this is someone that you're going to show up with and you're going to be very vulnerable with. You're telling them all your life's problems, and you better do your homework to make sure that they're safe, right? You can't always guarantee, but at least you can do your homework. So you can totally ask if they incorporate faith into sessions, what that looks like, where they've gotten their training from. Yeah.
Okay. And then we do have one last question. I
Right.
feel like I'm bombarding you, but you're doing a great job with the answering. Is there any specific voice tone to use to calm down callers, or transcript to use?
Sorry, can you ask that again?
Is there any specific voice tone to use to calm down callers?
To calm down callers?
Yeah. So like, for example, our counselors.
I'm very confused about the question.
Oh, sorry. Like I'm assuming like if there was a counselor receiving calls from an individual, is there a voice tone that you recommend to approach the situation when we're getting somebody who's dealing with trauma or is currently having like an anxiety attack?
Okay. Voice tone. I would imagine that you would talk in a very calm tone, and maybe slow down your pace, and lots of validation. You don't have to know exactly what's going on. You don't have to know the exact solution. So things like, oh my God, it sounds like you're really, really stressed out. This feels like a lot. Wow. How about if we take a breath together? It sounds like you're going through a lot. What do you need from me? How can I be helpful right now? Things like that.
Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Awesome. Thank you, Kamela, for this amazing presentation and for answering all these questions. I feel like I asked you so many.
You did. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. And this does conclude our workshop, everyone. Thank you all for attending. We do hope that you found this workshop helpful and you learned how to use emotional regulation in anxiety-inducing situations from Kamela. And for all those who registered on Zoom, as mentioned, you will receive a self-help guide created by the one and only Kamela in your inbox soon. And for those who didn't register through Zoom or who is watching with somebody else right now and you want to get access to this guide, you can get it over on our website at nisahelpline.com/wellness. I'm going to put that in the chat right now. There we go. And before we wrap up, we do have some exciting announcements. We have another workshop on navigating family dynamics on November 15th, and leading this workshop is registered psychotherapist Rina Venza. And yeah, if you guys want to get any more information on any upcoming workshops, you guys can follow our social media at Nisa Helpline, or again, visit our website at nisahelpline.com/wellness. And we're looking forward to seeing each and every one of you guys there, inshallah. Once again, thank you guys for joining us, and assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks, salam.